The next part of this week's material considers the history of public health in a very cursory way and very briefly, but still, it's important to look at the history of public health to understand why we're where we're at. Now, this quote by Rosen in 1953 um, basically plays on this idea that health is very much dependent on political, economic, and social factors, social environments. And so he's saying that, in fact, the history of public health, if we're looking at the history of public health, we really need to be understanding the political, economic, and social history of the time, as well as the public health events, to understand what was happening and why it happened. Um, and also, we need to understand what has happened in the past, because things weren't always the way they are now, and we have a health system which is designed in a particular way, and the best way to understand that is to understand how it actually got the way it is now. For example, um, we didn't always have a clean, hygienic environment, and we didn't always have this low prevalence of diseases like you might find in developing countries. And so there's a whole history behind that, and we need to understand that. And um, we also it also gives us an insight into evaluating our progress over time, to understand what diseases have gone up, what diseases have gone down, and so we might be able to relate that to the basic projects and initiatives that we've had over that period of time. But let's go way back even further than these Roman times and Greek times that these photographs represent. If we go back pre agriculture, so agriculture emerged maybe 8 to 10,000 years ago, and at that time there were only very few people around, so um, the human population was very sparse. Overcrowding was very unusual, and the main way in which people acquired food was through hunting and gathering. So gathering fruit, and also gathering wild cereals as well. And the population at that time was below 10 million, so people were very sparse. Life was shorter than it is today, and there were various mechanisms which actually slowed the rate of population. For a start, the nutrition status of populations, humans at that time, was thought to be quite low, and um, the nutrition status of humans is actually related to how fertile they are. So the, the population growth rate was quite low. Also, it's thought to have been due to higher mortality rates, as well as low fertility rates. But there was a period where there was this transition. It's called in fact, it's referred to as a Neolithic revolution, where um, mainstream agriculture was adopted by certain cultures, not everybody, but certain cultures, um, and it had a profound effect on population growth. So this is the time, as I mentioned, about 8 to 10,000 years ago, where population growth actually had a pretty significant kick along. And there was this transition amongst some communities, and it's considered this was thought to happen in the Middle East, in that area between in Mesopotamia. It's called between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was thought to be the birthplace of civilization as we know it. And due to a whole range of processes, the mortality rates went down and fertility rates went up. And so we ended up with this, what was an initial fairly steady population, human population rates globally, but they went up quite substantially. However, we didn't reach a billion until the early 1800s. And once we started to, especially once we started to intensify our population, to increase population density, this was where communicable diseases became a problem. Now, if we're thinking in public health terms about communicable or infectious disease, so these are diseases that you catch, and basically there are a whole range of different considerations that we need to bear in mind. So there's a list here. The host, we need to identify the disease, we need to describe where it occurs, we need to identify the infectious agent, we need to identify if there are any carriers, whether those carriers are human or elsewhere. Now, you might think of examples where there are other types of carriers. So for malaria, the mosquito. Dengue fever is also a disease where mosquitoes are a carrier. Rabies, carriers are dogs and wildlife. There's a disease called schistosomiasis, which is Schistosomiasis is also called snail fever because the carrier is a snail. So there's a range of different carriers you might come into contact with. Mode of transmission, so whether you catch it from fomites, which are inanimate sort of objects, or whether you can catch it from food or air, droplets from somebody breathing on you. How long the disease takes to develop, so once you're inoculated, how long it takes before symptoms become obvious, so that's the incubation period. Symptomatology, so symptomatology is the symptom specific to the disease. The other, prodrome, which is basically the syndrome is non-specific, so it could be a range of diseases. How long somebody is infectious for, what the variability and susceptibility is in a population, whether there's a certain part of the population that's immune for some reason. And also, moving on from that, public health is also interested in ways in which you might be able to control a particular disease, ways you can prevent, ways you can restrict the movement of a particular disease or quarantine a particular disease. That's also a public health consideration. In terms of epidemic, where the disease is affecting very large numbers of people, to work out ways in which a disease can be controlled across a population, and also where diseases like bird flu can be contained internationally. So these are some of the considerations when we think about communicable diseases these days. So those major problems with communicable diseases originated when our populations actually started to increase beyond the 1 billion mark, which is thought to have been due to the Neolithic Revolution, which is this time when we adopted agriculture as a mainstream activity. Now, I've got an example here of the complexity of infectious disease, and this example is something that's called bubonic plague. Plague or black plague, which there was a plague, or a series of plagues that happened during the Middle Ages, long before humans understood what germs are all about. But this is an example of the understanding the determinants of disease. So the way the disease works is that it's diagnosed by these buboes, what are called buboes, which are great big lumps that occur around the lymph nodes. This is a direct result of a bacterial infection. So this is the bacterium that is responsible for Black Plague, the Yersinia pestis is the bacterium. And basically the bacterium is the secondary host, or the reservoir for Yersinia pestis, is actually a flea which lives on a rat. And so if we're thinking about the environmental considerations for increase in the prevalence of Black Plague, it all hinges on whether there's a lot of rats living in close proximity to humans. Now, bubonic plague still exists, and exists in a range of developing countries from time to time. One of the ways in which a plague like this can be combated is through antibiotics. So this person would be treated with antibiotics. But in former times, there were no antibiotics. And no antibiotics, no understanding of germs. And so it caused quite a lot of deaths. Now, the environmental situation that lends itself to plague being a problem, Black Plague being a problem, is having rats living in close proximity to humans, fleas being able to jump from rats to humans. Now that might be housing. We might think about housing. We might think about waste, sewage. So all these factors will have a bearing on whether rats can live in close proximity to humans. On the other side of the equation, being able to deal with the bacterial infection once it's prevalent within the population, so a good hospital system and a good effective mechanism for delivering useful antibiotics. So there's a range of different factors which may actually contribute to the prevalence of bubonic plague in the human population.